Well, hello and welcome to Whistleblower Heroes, everyday heroes and educators sharing the information that you need to know here on Revolution Radio, and I'm your host, Ella. What is a whistleblower? I always start out with this. A whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosures of wrongdoing, corruption, and crime. These courageous people often suffer retaliatory actions because of their disclosures, but in the end, many of these people are often the catalyst for needed change and are eventually lauded as heroes. I am here to celebrate these heroes and give them a platform because shining a light on wrongdoing wherever it occurs plays an important role in keeping society peaceful, free, and just. And today is Tuesday. And Tuesdays I tend to interview people either that are associated with whistleblowers, authors, just people of interest. That's what I like to say. And they're educators and have some deep understanding of what's going on in politics. So with me today, I have Mr. Robert McGee. Hi, Robert.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure having you. And so I'm going to tell you guys about this very, very impressive man. Robert McGee is a best-selling author and political pundit who writes political fiction from an individualist perspective. Before becoming a novelist, he was a professor, attorney, CPA, and consultant. He also published 58 nonfiction books and lectured or worked in more than 30 countries. Former clients include United States Agency for International Development, World Bank, African Development Bank, and the Central Intelligence Agency. He holds 13 earned doctorates from the universities in the United States and 4 European countries. He has won 27 gold medals in Taekwondo National Championship tournaments, 6 first-place trophies in Karate National Championship tournaments, as well as 4 gold, 9 silver, and 4 bronze medals in world championships. He is world champion in Taekwondo, Kung Fu, and Karate, and a silver medalist in Tai Chi, and has been inducted into the United States Martial Arts Hall of Fame. And his first novel, Justifiable Homicide, is a political thriller, is a controversial political novel which discusses the killing of corrupt politicians and much more. So is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I know you have a lot, you've had a long life and you've accomplished much. So would you like to share anything else in the intro?
Oh, there's so much to share, but you make me sound so good, I should probably quit while I'm ahead.
Well, during the interview, we can share a little bit more because I just found you to be one of the most compelling people I've ever come across.
Oh, well, thank you.
Okay, so I guess let's start at the beginning. I'm always interested what makes a person tick and how you ended up doing the work that you're doing and how you became a writer and how you became interested in accounting, because I know that was your first, well, it's not your first. I think it was your second interest. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, I really love economics. And I started out as an accounting major undergraduate, but after 3 semesters, it became so boring that I switched to economics. And I was an economics major as an undergraduate with minors in political science, philosophy, history, and theology. And but my first job out, well, my second job out actually, was as a bank auditor. And I never had an auditing class, so I had to go back to night school and take auditing. And the people who hired me at the bank didn't know that I never had auditing. They just said, "You've had lots of accounting, haven't you?" And I said, "Yes." And so I got the job, but I didn't know what I was doing. So I went back to night school and took an auditing class and other accounting classes, and they never knew that I didn't know what I was doing.
Okay, interesting. And so then we'll progress maybe a year or two. So what did you decide to get into, and what was your first job in economics? I mean, you mentioned a couple things already, but what happened at that point?
I taught high school math for 1 year. I really loved algebra. I didn't like it at first. I actually failed algebra for a 6-week session in high school. But then once I understood what it was all about, I really loved it. And so the first year out of school after I graduated was teaching algebra in high school. And I liked the subject, but I didn't like teaching high school students because they didn't want to be there. They didn't listen. And so, yeah, so it was painful. I hated to get up in the morning. So after doing that for a year, I got a job as at a bank. And then I switched jobs and became a bank auditor, even though I didn't know anything about it. Because on the resume, it showed that I had some experience in banking, which is a combination of accounting, finance, and economics. And I really liked working in banking. Mm-hmm. And I liked being an auditor, too, which may seem a little strange, but it's a good way to understand and learn how the bank works because you get to see every department. And I faked it for a while because I didn't know what I was doing until I had a few accounting courses. And then I got tired of doing that after a while. I had an opportunity to go to Chicago. I was accepted at a law school there. And so I got a job in Chicago, and I got a job working as a tax accountant for Sunbeam Corporation. But I never had a tax class. And so I didn't know what I was doing again. And the people who hired me at Sunbeam just saw that I had several years of bank auditing experience, and they just assumed I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. So I went to night school and got a master's degree in taxation. And again, I faked it until I made it. So much of the 1970s were faking it until I made it, actually. I took jobs I wasn't qualified for, and then I just learned what I had to learn, going to night school and reading as much as I could and asking the right questions.
Nice, very nice. An interesting way to get a job and to keep your job.
Yes, yeah, just fake it till you make it.
And so, were you starting to get interested in politics, or was it more the financial aspects of the government that was intriguing to you, or how financing works?
Well, my interest in politics really started in my sophomore year of college. As an undergraduate, I was going to a liberal arts school, Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania, and they made us take a lot of philosophy classes and some political science because they had professors who would teach for almost nothing. Priests that I heard through the rumor mill, they paid them $75 a month to teach. And so they made us take all these philosophy courses and other things. And I became interested in politics. And my parents were sort of Democrats, although my father voted for Eisenhower twice because he was a military guy. Well, he was in World War II for about 6 weeks, and then the war ended. So, but he liked Eisenhower, and so he voted for Eisenhower, and my mother voted for Stevenson in 1952 and 56. So their votes canceled each other out, but they were mostly Democrats, and my parents' friends were all Democrats, so I thought I was a Democrat too. But then when I started reading, I came up with, some inner conflicts there. Like I didn't really like a lot of the things the Democratic Party stood for. And these were the days of Richard Nixon in the 1960s. I didn't like Nixon too much either, but he seemed a little less bad than the Democrats. And so I did some reading, and I somehow got connected with the Foundation for Economic Education. They were in Irvington and Hudson, New York at the time, and they sent me a lot of free publications. They invited me to one of their seminars. So I borrowed my father's car and drove to New York for a weekend, and I met some really, really interesting people. I got to meet Ludwig von Mises, who some people say is the greatest economist of the 20th century. A lot of people disagree with that, of course, but I got to meet him and some other people, and then I got his autograph on some books, and I made some contacts there, and I kept sending them questions all the time. And this is before the internet, when I had to write it out longhand, and they were very good about answering my questions. And after reading things like that, and then Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, and Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative, I was pretty much hooked on the idea of small government and individual liberty. And so that all started really in my sophomore year of college, and it just developed from there. And the reason I went into taxation, and the reason I got a master's in taxation, I wanted to help people avoid as much as they could, because I thought most people who pay taxes are being overcharged. So the reason I went in that direction is partly ideological, partly to help people, not so much to carve out a career for myself. And the same thing with law school. I went to law school and I wanted to help people keep their hard-earned money, basically. So I became a tax attorney, and I had to practice in Manhattan for a while during the day, and I taught at Seton Hall University in the evenings in their MBA program. So that was nice. I was keeping busy, and I was learning a lot, because you learn a lot when you teach. And certainly when you defend
Robert, there's
clients.
a little bit, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a little bit of background noise or something, and I don't want anything to take away from what you're saying. Like a little bit of bumping or something.
Oh, well, I don't know why that is. I'll try to stay, maybe because I was touching the headphones.
Maybe, who knows? Okay, go ahead. Sorry about that. I just want your
Okay.
words to be heard clearly.
Okay, very good. So anyway, I wanted to, defend people against the IRS. And since I was in Manhattan, I was only a few blocks from their appellate headquarters. So I had to take some clients in there sometimes. And it was sort of depressing at times because the IRS sometimes abuses power. Perhaps you've heard.
Most of us are aware of that.
Once or twice, yeah. Yeah, and this one client, they wanted to put a padlock on his business, and the IRS agent said, I'm going away he was in the National Guard, he was going away to camp for a few weeks, and if he didn't get the payment that the IRS demanded by the time he left, that he was going to put a padlock on the business. And you break the padlock, it's a felony, supposedly. And so the client paid, even though he didn't owe the money, just because he didn't want his business shut down. So that's, one example of an abuse of power. And there are others that, they're in the press practically every month. You'll see something about the IRS abusing its power. That's one particular thing that happened to my client. So he was upset, but he was glad to pay him off just so he could get him off his back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe we can fast forward. So I know you start going abroad. When did this occur? When did you start traveling to these other countries to do work? Because I find that fascinating. And also the CIA. How did you get involved with that? With them?
Okay, well, I can give you the CIA story first.
Sure.
I mean, it looks great on a resume and it looks great on the book cover, but actually I didn't do much for them. They had read an article that I had posted on the Social Science Research Network, and they were having a seminar in the Washington, D.C. area, and they wanted me to talk about the paper. And so that's the extent of my involvement. It was just one afternoon lecture. But it was enough to say that the CIA was my client because they gave me a check and a 1099 form. So perhaps I hyped it a bit too much, but that's all it was.
It is intriguing.
Yeah,
and you are an author, so you know how to put a nice spin on it. It's very intriguing.
Yeah.
And I know like you worked in the Middle East as well, and you helped set up financial institutions.
Yeah, and that was all sort of by accident, I guess. I'll answer that other question you had first.
Sure.
About when did I start going overseas to work? Well, some of my doctorates, 10 of my 13 doctorates are from European schools. And so I started getting those in the 1980s. And I would fly back and forth to see my thesis supervisors because in a lot of the systems over there, you don't have to do any coursework for a PhD. You just write a thesis. And so I was living in New Jersey at the time, and I was writing a few theses at the same time. I was enrolled in 3 schools at once for a while, and I would fly back and forth to see my supervisors. It was before the internet, and I'd have to type out chapters of my dissertations and send them over airmail. And that's how I started going to Europe. But then shortly after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, a few years after that, I decided to contact some academics over there, and I asked them to write chapters for an edited book that I had in mind about changes in Eastern Europe, mostly from the economic perspective. They were trying to change from a centrally planned system to something that looked like a Western system. And they didn't know which Western system they wanted, something like England or France or Australia or the United States. And so I received a lot of acceptances, and it turned out that I wrote I edited a really nice book, and they invited me there to give lectures. So I flew over there, and I landed in Krakow, Poland. It was one of the places I went, and as soon as I got off the plane, they handed me an envelope filled with cash. It was something like $1.5 million zlotys, which was $75, but that was my lecture fee. And they paid my airfare plus $75, which was a big wad of cash. And then I kept going back to those places. One thing led to another, and I lectured in most of the countries in Eastern and Central Europe. Some of my doctorates are from those places too, like Hungarian Academy of Sciences and Tartu University and so forth. And again, one thing led to another. So then I was at Seton Hall University. I had an opportunity to go on a sabbatical, which is a nice deal because basically you don't have to show up at the university for a year, and I was paid 75% of my full salary. And they want you to go somewhere and recharge your batteries. So I answered an ad in the Journal of Accountancy. Someone was looking for accountants in Eastern Europe. But it turned out it was a consulting company. They had landed a USAID contract to reform the accounting system in Armenia. So it wasn't really they were looking for accountants, they were looking for consultants. So I applied, and because I had a background in Eastern Europe, because of all those publications and the trips, they figured I would be a good candidate. So they sent me to Armenia for 13 months, and I drafted their accounting law. I helped the universities convert their accounting curriculums, and I helped the finance ministry convert the country to international accounting standards. And then I had to return to Seton Hall University after that for the end of my sabbatical. But then the following year, I got an offer from Bosnia. Again, it was a USAID contract. And they wanted me to do the same thing for Bosnia. And so I did. But Seton Hall didn't want to let me go, so I just quit Seton Hall and went to Bosnia anyway. It turned out that was a good deal because when I came back, I got a better job offer from another university. So it was a way to get out of New Jersey and a way to see Bosnia. I was in Bosnia for 13 months also. That was an interesting thing because Bosnia is really like three countries. There's the Serb part. They have 49% of the real estate because they lost the war. They had a series of civil wars there. And then the other part, they call it the Muslim-Croat Federation because it's Muslims and Croatians got together to fight the Serbs, and they won the war. So they got 51% of the real estate. And I just spent 50% of my time in the Muslim-Croat Federation and 50% in the Serbian part, and they all had their own ideas about each other and about how the accounting system could be reformed. And so USAID wasted a lot of money on that project, which I guess, does that make me a whistleblower?
In a way.
Yeah, yes.
In a way, disclosure of corruption, yes.
Yeah. And in fact, I was sort of shocked to learn that some of the money went to repair a mosque in Sarajevo. The mosque was damaged during the war. Somebody hit it with a few artillery shells, and U.S. taxpayers paid, I don't know, over $1 million to repair that mosque, which, you're not supposed to support religion in the United States, but they were supporting the Muslim religion in Bosnia.
And is that where your idea for the Iraqi girl novel came up?
Well, Sarajevo was basically a Muslim city, so that's where I got my first introduction to Islam, other than what I read in the newspapers. And I found that Islam is a pretty diverse religion. Like my driver,
it really is.
Yeah, my driver was a Muslim, and I asked him, "What kind of Muslim are you, Sunni or Shia?" And he didn't know. He said, "I'll have to ask my grandmother." All he knew was that he was a Muslim, and he got drunk every Thursday night, but he wouldn't drink on Friday because that was a Muslim holy day. And he had blonde hair and blue eyes. He looked like a Polish Catholic from Chicago, actually, but he was a Muslim.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
What did you think about it? Sorry to interrupt you there. How was the livability? What were the people like? How did they treat you? Were you speaking any of the language?
Well, I learned about 5 words of Bosnian, and the Bosnian language, Croatian and Serbian are about 95% the same. So I spoke all 3 languages equally, the same 5 words. I think hello, thank you, beer, bread, and something else, which I forget. Where's the toilet? Maybe something like that.
Right. That was going to be my guess.
Yeah, all the important words. So I enjoyed my experience there. I felt a little unsafe in Sarajevo, though, because everybody knew I was an American and it was primarily Muslim. And Muslims didn't really like Americans all that much because we've been bombing them and so forth.
Yeah,
the Serbs loved us because we bombed Muslims, but then the Serbs didn't like us when we came in and bombed the Serbs, because the Serbs were winning the war in Yugoslavia until we started bombing the Serbs. So we had a lot of enemies. They treated me very well on the surface, but beneath the surface, I could feel a little hatred and animosity. So, I'm glad I had the experience, but I don't know if I'd want to go back there. I've heard that things haven't really changed that much since I was there. The hatred is still there. It's just beneath the surface.
Yeah. I mean, I've met many people who are Muslim or the Middle East living in Los Angeles, and there really is an underlying hatred towards Americans, unfortunately. They've admitted to me.
Yeah. They hate each other, too.
That's true. Just a lot of hatred. I don't know. It's when you're there is a lot of hatred, and it's unfortunate. It's kind of ingrained to their thinking. Yeah, it is. They're taught that from their parents, and especially since the war. They used to have a lot of intermarriage. Someone told me that 38% of the marriages were
interreligious, like a Muslim would marry a Catholic or something. But after the war, that changed, and now Muslims will only marry Muslims, and Catholics will only marry Catholics, and so forth.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And so then what? What was next on your adventure?
Well, after I had a pretty successful run in Armenia, I mean, I say pretty successful because they accepted almost all of my advice, and it was okay in Bosnia, but there was so much interfighting that was not a disaster, but not a complete success. But the USAID and the Asian Development Bank and some other companies picked me up for consulting engagements of a shorter duration. So I drafted the laws for Armenia and Bosnia, and Mozambique wanted me to look at theirs. Someone else had already drafted theirs, but they wanted me to review it. So I reviewed the accounting law for Mozambique, and I went to Tanzania and Rwanda, and I taught accountants and finance ministry people and academics about international accounting, which is sort of interesting because we don't use international accounting in the United States. And the U.S. State Department was funding all these USAID projects to teach the rival system. It was really against our interest to do that, but we did it. And they spent millions of dollars in each of these countries pushing international accounting standards instead of U.S. standards. So another case where the U.S. State Department's working against U.S. interest.
Well, it seems it's always something like that.
Yeah.
What did you think about those places, the cultures, and as far as livability and in comparison maybe to United States?
Oh, wow. Major difference. Like in Armenia, like in the university system, they basically had one accounting course, which they called bookkeeping. There was no Russian word for accountant, actually. They used a German word for bookkeeper, Buchhalter. And in the Armenian language, there was no word for accountant either. So they didn't know the difference between an accountant and a bookkeeper. They didn't really have a cost accounting system because everything was centrally planned. You know, someone in Moscow would give an order to make 1,000 units of something, and they would ship them the raw materials, and it didn't matter how much it cost because all costs were arbitrary anyway. And so they had to learn a completely new system, and they were eager to learn it, not so much so that they could rebuild their country, but so that they could have new skills and go to the West with a one-way ticket. And so I was training all these people to be expats. That was a mentality. Just about everybody under the age of 65 in Armenia wanted to get out. And that was in the
that wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. And I couldn't really blame them. They were really smart, hardworking people. And being Armenian, you knew the Armenian language and also Russian, because Russian used to be the official language, one of them anyway. And they all learned English. There's a big French connection. They loved Charles Aznavour because he did something there, I guess. There's a big Armenian-French connection. And they all love Cher. They insist she's 100% Armenian. Her house says she's 50%. Her songs were playing all over the place. Like Dove Amore, that was a big song when I was there. That was people were blasting that out of the storefronts and in their car radios. It was all over. It's a really nice place to live if you have an American paycheck.
I see.
You can have dinner in those days anyway for $4 or $5, a really good Armenian dinner, and they used every opportunity to celebrate and have little parties, and they'd have like 15-course meals with, you know, either vodka or cognac. Churchill used to buy his cognac from Armenia in the old days, and so everybody in Armenia knew which brand it was too, and they would serve that on special occasions. Otherwise, they'd serve the regular sort of rot gut stuff. Yeah, they're very proud of their country. And they were telling me that Armenia was 2% of the Soviet population, but 11% of the scientists. Yeah, very, very proud of their country. And they deserve to be proud of it. A lot of accomplishments.
Sounds like it. Definitely sounds like it. Yeah, who knew that accounting could be so fascinating?
Yeah, I didn't even know it at first. In fact, I got out of accounting because I thought it was boring. You know, after 3 semesters, I only got back into it because I needed it to keep my job.
Right.
And once I saw how it worked, you know, the inner workings, where it's like a puzzle with no pieces missing, that's when I really got fascinated with it. And I'm still fascinated with it. I'm an accounting professor. So.
And so where did you go after that? What was next down the road?
Uh, well, I went to, before that, I did little consulting gigs in Central Europe, like Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania. I was a visiting professor at the Romanian American University, and I met the president of Romania totally by accident. He was in a cafe sitting 3 tables away from me, and
Mm-hmm.
the students who were in charge of keeping me happy mentioned that that guy over there is the president. So I had my photo taken with them. And they have a lot of good food there too. And then they took me for a tour of Dracula's castle in Transylvania. That's in Romania.
I've seen
And
pictures of it. It looks interesting.
yeah, yeah, it's not as large as you might think. It's just a little castle, but
Huh.
I made sure that I got out of there before the sun went down, just to make sure.
And I had some pasta for dinner with lots of garlic.
Lots of garlic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Hungary was an interesting place too. I got to meet a lot of the professors over there could speak German because before the Soviets took over, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they spoke German as well as Hungarian, and then they wanted to learn English and some other languages so they can get out of Hungary, because nobody outside of Hungary speaks Hungarian. They were all very friendly, but I got the idea that I was like a tool for them, someone that they could use to get out of Hungary, not a real friend. And it wasn't that way just in Hungary. It was all throughout the former Soviet Union that people would make friends with me. And then, 2 weeks later, they'd say, do you think I can get a visa? How would you help me, kind of thing. So, yeah. So I developed a lot of friends there, but I don't know if push came to shove, if they'd really be my friends.
Right, how genuine those friendships were. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's hear a little bit about your martial arts. That's fascinating as well. You're so accomplished, and I'd like to touch upon that, and then I'd like to get to your novels and talk about future projects. So,
Okay. Well, my martial arts experience sort of started in middle school because people try to beat me up sometimes. Uh, I like to play baseball in the summer, and I go to the baseball diamond. There were 3 of them in back of my house, and sometimes if you wanted to play, you had to fight the bullies. And so I got some sort of street experience doing that. But back in those days, they would just use Marcus at Queensberry rules, no knives, no guns, no punching or kicking below the belt, because they had principles, they had honor, so to speak. So
mm-hmm.
I didn't have to confront people with knives and guns. It was just bullies with punches, kind of thing. And so in high school, I was on the wrestling team. I wasn't that good, but I was on the team. And one of the guys who was a boxer, a high school student at the time, he later turned pro. I was one of his sparring partners, and he went on to fight 56 pro fights. So he taught me a few things about boxing. I would usually block his punches with my face. That's supposed to be a joke.
Okay.
Let me repeat that. I
One more time. Maybe I just kind of wasn't paying close enough attention there.
Okay, here it goes. I would block his punches with my face.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And
Now, sorry about that. Sometimes I tune out just for a second.
yeah, well, it's the same with my students. I have to announce that was a joke because nobody ever laughs. So it's the same thing. And so I got a little boxing experience there, and I took some judo lessons in high school, but I couldn't afford the lessons, so I dropped out after a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then several years later, I moved to New Jersey, and I got to train for about 4 years under Sensei Shigeru Kimura, who was a former world champion in one of the Japanese styles, Shukokai. And so that was a good experience. But then I dropped out of that shortly before the 1986 Tax Reform Act because I got too busy. I was working as a consultant to Prentice Hall at the time, and I was one of the people who would put their books together, the kind of books that practitioners use, to understand the law. And so we were working overtime, and so I had to drop out of the karate in 1986, and I didn't go back afterwards. But then when I moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina in 2012, I was looking for a place to work out because I work out with weights. I used to anyway. But I couldn't find a place that was close by. And I saw this sign that said ATA Black Belt Academy. And ATA stands for American Taekwondo Association. That's a a Korean style, like karate, with a few little subtle differences. And so I was 65 at the time, and I didn't know if I could do it. I thought I might have a heart attack if I tried. But I went there, and they offered me 30 days of free lessons, and I figured I'll take it, and I'll see what happens. If I don't have a heart attack, maybe I'll continue. And so I didn't have a heart attack, and I sort of liked it. I started losing weight. I lost 25 pounds in the first year doing that. And so they made me start over as a white belt because I'd been away from the martial arts for so long. Mm-hmm. So I started as a white belt.
And then they had to work your way back up.
Yeah, had to work it back up. And there was a local tournament. They wanted me to compete in that, and I didn't want to, but I did. And I did okay. I think I got a gold medal and a silver medal or something, competing against people my own age, which I was 65 when I went back. So that was okay. And then they wanted me to do a regional tournament in Raleigh or Durham. And so I did that, and I did better than I thought. And then after doing enough regional tournaments, I decided on my own to go for the national championship. And they have those in the spring and fall. One is in Orlando usually, and the other's in Las Vegas. So I started doing national championships, and sometimes I'd win, sometimes I'd lose, but it was a good experience. And I did manage to get 27 gold medals, and still counting, because I'm still doing that.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then my instructor suggested that I take some Tai Chi classes just to give me a more solid foundation, because my stances were a little wobbly sometimes. And so I started taking Tai Chi. But my Tai Chi instructor also taught Kung Fu, so I decided to take both Tai Chi and Kung Fu and continue with the Taekwondo. And I was also taking Krav Maga. That's an Israeli defense thing that the Israeli army uses. So I was doing 4 at once for a while. And then I dropped out of Krav Maga because it was just too much doing 4 things. But I continued with that, and then I decided to compete in both the karate and the Taekwondo circuit, and I also did some Kung Fu, and I managed to get gold medals in all of those. Again, I had to pay Chuck Norris a lot of money not to show up at those tournaments, but that's also a joke, by the way. There you go.
It's your delivery. It's so serious that you don't think it takes a second. That's all. It's your delivery.
Yeah. My students have the same problem. They don't get my jokes either. Yeah, it's gotten to the point where I tell them they get extra points if they laugh before I tell them it's a joke.
Yeah, it's definitely how you speak. Well, okay. Well, and then now you're in the what is it? You're one of the world champions.
Yeah, I'm the reigning world champion in sparring, and I got that. Last year I was 70. And I decided to compete with the 50-year-olds. The oldest group is 60 plus, but I wanted to go with the 50 plus group just to challenge myself to see if I could do it. Mm-hmm. And I did it, just barely. The guy who's number 2 was almost number 1. I had to really fight for that. And so this year I'm in the 60 plus group because I don't want to challenge myself that much anymore. But now I'm 71. But I managed to win the world championship in the 50 plus age category somehow.
Mm-hmm. Very commendable. Very commendable. So now you've written 58 fiction books. Let's talk about all these books. I mean, when did you start writing? And let's, we have to go back a little bit, I guess, and figure out where this interest developed. And let's start from there.
Okay. Well, I could start out by saying I failed freshman English in college. I had to take it 3 times before I passed. I didn't have writing skills in those days, and apparently they developed somehow. I had a mentor for a while. I used to work as a consultant to Harcourt Brace, the publishing company in New York, and it was a subsidiary. Miller CPA Review was the name of the subsidiary, and Martin Miller was the president. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a famous, well, I don't know about famous, but really good CPA review, one of the best in the country. And then they sold it to Kaplan, I think, at some point. But when I was there, it was Miller CPA Review, and the president, Martin A. Miller, whose birthday is on February 5th, he always reminded us of that. He taught me how to write because I was writing some of the materials that CPA candidates would use to prepare for the exam. And so I would write the material. I thought he did it perfectly, and then he would find 5 or 10 or 15 places where I could make it better. So after working with him for a while, he kept correcting all my mistakes all the time, and it got to the point where I wasn't making as many mistakes. So he's the one who taught me to write, and it was technical writing, but technical writing helped me with my academic things because I could write academic articles. I wrote my first academic article in 1975. I was working at Sunbeam Corporation as a tax accountant, and the guy sitting at the desk next to me had published an article in one of the tax journals, and he was always asking me questions about things. He didn't know the answers, and I figured, wow, if that guy can get published, maybe I should give it a try. And so I gave it a try. I wrote an article on the current topic, and I sent it into one of the tax journals, and it was accepted. And then I thought, wow, this is fun. I'll see if I can do it again. And so that's when I started doing tax articles. And then at some point I started doing books for Prentice Hall and Harcourt Brace and some other publishers, mostly technical stuff. I started off in accounting and taxation, and then I did some finance, economics, and I did some ethics and philosophy and things like that too. And so I just did my 59th nonfiction book a few months ago. So I did 58 nonfiction.
If you're good with numbers, you're not supposed to be able to be a creative writer. That's two different parts of the brain. That usually somebody's good at one thing, not the other, like math or writing. So that's interesting. You're talented at both.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. Well, accountants are supposed to be creative, so maybe I
guess so. Sometimes creative accounting is you're right. I didn't think of it like that.
Yeah. So there's some creativity there somewhere. But the nice thing about fiction is you can make stuff up. You don't have to footnote everything. You don't have to make sure things are accurate. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the things in my novels are accurate, especially like the fighting scenes with the martial arts. Those are accurate. And the scene locations in most cases are accurate because I've actually been to those places. Mm-hmm. And what I do now, whenever I go on vacation or whenever I go to lecture someplace, I take photographs of things like cafes or buildings or street signs so that I can remember names and things like that so that I can incorporate them into my novels at some later date.
Mm-hmm. So, and most of your novels are based on current events, you've said. You just kind of change the names and kind of twist some of the ideas.
Yeah, that's all I do. And in my first novel, Justifiable Homicide, it was set in Miami, where there's a very large Hispanic population, not just Cubans. They have other kinds of Hispanics too. But how I chose the names for the characters, I went through the list of my students, and I took the first name of one student and the last name of another student. And that's how I got the names for the characters.
I see. But I have to say, after kind of perusing a little bit, and you're looking at your books, there is a common idea. There's a running idea I see in most of the books that at least are on your website. There's vigilante justice.
Yes. Yeah, the legal system fails sometimes.
Yes, it does.
There are bad people out there who should be stopped. And vigilante justice is a way to stop them. It's sort of like the Charles Bronson effect, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Charles Bronson would be the kind of guy who would be an accounting professor doing this. But I was thinking maybe Matthew
McConaughey. Yeah, there you go. Mm-hmm.
Or Arnold Schwarzenegger. He could be an accountant, I guess. He was a babysitter in one movie, so... I suppose he could be.
Well, Matthew played a lawyer, and he did a fairly good job.
Yeah, the Lincoln Lawyer. Yep. So there are those would be good. Or, so.
But the topic matter. I'm sorry, I kind of jumped off. I didn't mean to step on you there. The topic. The matter, the content in the books is so important, like you're talking about in Iraqi Girl, which is very compelling to me. You said volume 1 of the Iraqi Girl trilogy introduces readers to, how do you say her name? Musama?
Yeah, Musama.
Yeah, she's sexually abused by U.S. soldiers at the age of 5. And I have actually interviewed a gentleman who was in the Middle East and had witnessed similar things. Usually, though, it was by the supposedly non-threatening village members who were like staying at the bottom of one of the compounds, and there was rape going on within the village communities. But I have heard really sad things like this. So this content is based on reality, as you said. These
Yes,
are
it
real
is.
issues.
Yeah, yeah, and I deal with the issue of female genital mutilation,
So you're doing
which
that book.
is
Mhm.
it's a big thing going over there. Well, not just there, but it's happening in London and Paris now too, with the Muslim populations there. They're doing that, and they're doing honor killings. If a young Muslim girl dates a non-Muslim or disobeys her father, sometimes they kill her, and it's part of a mercy killing, not a mercy killing, but rather a family honor kind of thing. So yeah, there's a lot of that. And Musafa's name, the name of that girl, the Iraqi girl, I actually went onto the internet, and there was a list of thousands of people who died in Iraq, and I took her name sort of to honor her memory. The name is of a real girl, 14 years old, who was I forget the exact date, but she was either killed by Iraqis or by insurgents. Nobody knows who killed her, but 20 or 30 people were killed in the village that night, and she was one of them. And so it's a means of honoring her name, even though I don't know who she is. But there is a real person, used to be a real person with that name.
That's interesting. Yeah, I just love the idea. And again, it's politically tied into many of these topics. And then in justifiable homicide, it's about killing political league. I didn't read the book, so maybe you can fill it in for me a little bit. I'd like to talk about that book a little bit because it seems fascinating. And if I have time, that's the book I would like to read first.
Well, that's the one I recommend. That's the one I'm most proud of, because that's the one that has the fullest exposition of my own political philosophy. I've it's sort of evolved over the years. But the question I address, and I don't really answer the question, I just raise the point, how many of our rights can they take away from us before killing them becomes justifiable homicide? And then I go on to say, like, the Hitlers and Stalins and Pol Pots of the world are, terrorist killer kind of people. And if you killed one of those people, I mean, think of what would have happened if somebody would have killed Hitler in 1932, for instance. We could have avoided World War II. We'd have tens of millions of people who wouldn't have been killed and murdered by the various armies. So killing Hitler in 1932 would have been justifiable. And the same with Stalin and Pol Pot before they could do damage. But what about these lesser people, the bureaucrats that just follow orders, or army people who just follow orders? I mean, how bad do they have to be before killing them would be justifiable homicide instead of murder? Because it's either one or the other. It's either murder or justifiable homicide. And there's a line there someplace. And I don't know where to draw that line. It's a highly subjective line. So I let my readers draw the line. I come up with these characters who do bad things, but not as bad as Hitler, but pretty bad. They destroy lives. They make people's lives miserable. And then they get on the list of people to be assassinated by this group of patriots in Miami. And they go through the list. They're not always successful, but sometimes they are. And they have disputes among themselves as to who should go on the list and what criteria they should use to determine who goes on the list. And that's where the political philosophy comes in. I mean, how can you justify killing some people? If they were duly elected, you'd think they shouldn't be killed, but Hitler was duly elected, and so was Mussolini. So you can't depend on democracy to make people, justifiable, so to speak. So I raised the question. I don't know if there is any answer that anyone can agree on, but I thought it would be fun to raise the question. Just like Socrates, he never answered any questions. He would always ask questions and let the students come up with answers. So again, that's the nice thing about being a fiction writer. You can just ask questions and let them figure out what the answers might be. And the answers aren't going to be all the same. It's what principles do you use? Do you use utilitarian ethics, or do you use rights theory? Again, how many of the rights can you take away before killing them becomes justifiable? And the whole book is imbued with that philosophy.
And your books seem to have, I don't know if they're undertones or overtones. There is some sexual, I guess, undertones. They're very sensual books.
Oh, thank you.
They seem to be. Yeah, they do.
there's a story I could tell about that one too. There are 3 what I might call sex scenes in Justifiable Homicide. And after I wrote them, I gave them to my older daughter. I have 2 of them. I gave her to my older daughter to read the book. And she said, Daddy, those sex scenes are too bland. Let me rewrite them for you. And so 2 of those 3 sex scenes were actually written by my daughter number 1. And in fact, she couldn't stop. She wrote 3 sex scenes. I used 2 of them in the book, and I have another one in a file that I'm going to use in another novel someday. So again, I'm an accountant. I can't write good sex scenes, but I have a daughter who can write good sex scenes. So.
There you go. That is an interesting story. Another very, very interesting story. So, do you want to touch upon any other of your books? We still have like 13 minutes. So, one thing I did want to get is your opinion on politics today, and talk about any upcoming projects. So it's up to you. We still have some time left.
Oh, okay. I could talk a few hours about that. Of the various political candidates. I mean, my own philosophy is pretty much libertarian with a twist of conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I basically
I heard that in
think,
your interview. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the government should be small, especially the federal government. The farther away the government is, the smaller it should be, I think, because governments can do a lot of damage, and people in Washington don't really know what's good for the rest of the country. They don't even know what's good for Washington a lot of times. So that the less power you give them, the less opportunity they have to abuse it. And one meme that I wrote, and I plastered it on the internet, was, if you're afraid of what the president might do, the solution is quite easy. Take away so much power from Washington that it doesn't matter who the president is. Mm-hmm. And that's the philosophy they use in Switzerland pretty much. A lot of people in Switzerland don't even know who the president of Switzerland is. He's such an insignificant figure because most political decisions are made at the cantonal level, like the little Swiss states that they have. Power is decentralized. And again, when power is decentralized, people tend to be more free. And if we had just 50 states and a very small federal government, if you didn't like the state you lived in, it would be very easy to move to another state. But, if you don't like the federal government, where do you move to? Well, some movie stars said they want to move to Canada. But, Canada might not accept them. They have rules about immigration, too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting about Switzerland. It's been very educational.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, a little bit of information that I just picked up reading some political science book. It was one of my required courses back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. So, decentralized government is friendly to freedom more so than a centralized government. Mm-hmm. So, and that's general everywhere. And the theory goes back to ancient Greece. It's not a new theory. Again, that's something I learned from my philosophy classes. The classes I didn't like at the time, but as I look back on them, I wish I could take some of them again, because there's really a lot of good information there.
Yeah, I feel the way too, like political science, snore when I was younger. It's like, gosh, all that stuff that I did not find interesting at all. The professors were right. As you grow older, you would take an interest in some of these classes that you had no interest at all when you were younger.
Yeah. If I could take them again, I'd see them from a whole new perspective.
Well, I love philosophy, though.
Yeah, me too. And it's a bottomless pit. You can always ask another question. It's just like on one rock after another. There's always another rock to turn over.
There is. Mm-hmm. And a different perspective, too. A different answer.
Yeah. Diametrically opposed sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So what do you think about everything that's going on with Russia?
Well, I think the whole thing is overblown. What did they actually do? They posted a few things on Facebook. How's that going to change the results of an election? It's compared to what Hillary did. Hillary gave away 20% of our uranium to Russia, and nobody's saying anything about that.
Yeah, I saw that. You talked about that in one of your interviews. It was really interesting to me.
Yeah, and Mueller was the head of the FBI when she did that too, and he supposedly knew about it. So, why isn't anyone investigating that? And the Clinton Foundation, from an accounting perspective, is a fascinating thing, because if you want to take bribes and have people get tax deductions for it, that's a great way to do it, because the Clinton Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and anyone who gives money to them gets a tax deduction. And apparently they don't distribute much of the money. Like Haiti didn't get much. They raised a lot of money for Haiti, and the Haitians didn't get much out of that at all. And
that's
if you're in
disappointing.
power, if you're like president or secretary of state, you have a lot of leverage. You can get people to donate millions of dollars to your foundation, get a tax deduction, and you get to use that money to hire. Like I read that Hillary's daughter was making like $700,000 or $800,000 or $900,000 a year or something in salary, some really big salary. And so, if you're the head of a foundation with that kind of power, you can pay the kids, and unless you're audited, that you can continue doing that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So from an accounting perspective, it's a fascinating way to do business. I mean, I wouldn't advise my clients to do that because there's a lot of felonies involved there, probably. But again, that's not being investigated either. Not yet.
What do you think about like the CIA and some of the black ops and deep state? Do you believe in the deep state? I guess that's my question.
Definitely. Yeah, it definitely exists. I mean, as part of those USAID projects, I got to observe some of that because USAID is part of the U.S. State Department. Or they were doing a lot of things that were unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. Wasting billions of dollars, and none of that's justified by the Constitution. There's nothing that says you can use taxpayer money to give to other countries, but they justify it through the General Welfare Clause. You can do anything that's for the general welfare, except it doesn't really help the United States. So a judge with any kind of backbone would say that that's all unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. But and I read books about, what the CIA has done. There's several books on Latin America by a whistleblower. I forget the guy's name, but he wrote a few books. He was a former CIA guy that participated in some of that Latin American stuff. And
was it John Kiriakou?
No.
He brought up Latin America at one point. I interviewed him. Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
I forget the guy's name. He wrote like 2 or 3 books on it. One of those books was actually banned in the United States. I had to buy it through Amazon.com in England, and they shipped it to me because it's banned in the United States, which, how does that comply with the First Amendment? You're not supposed to ban books, but that one's banned. I have a copy. I probably shouldn't say that because now somebody's going to knock down my door. So,
we'll hope not.
Yeah, well, I hope not too. Yeah, but that's how it is. And speaking about influencing elections, there's I don't know what the website is, but if you go to Google and just hit the right keywords, you'll find it. Some academic is keeping track of all the elections that the United States government has interfered with since the early 1950s. And I think the count is now up to 80 or 82, something like that. We've interfered in more than 80 elections in foreign countries since the early 1950s. And other things too. I mean, like the Shah of Iran, we were responsible for that fiasco. I mean, by we, I mean the CIA, at least according to, books and articles and so forth. So that the CIA has done a lot of damage to our foreign policy. I can't say they're all bad because they've probably done some good things too. And I don't know that much about the CIA. I mean, I was only, I gave a lecture once and I got a 1099 form. But I've met some CIA people abroad. They don't say they're CIA, but you can sort of tell. Like on those USAID projects, if you start talking about international development and they don't know what you're talking about, but yet they work for USAID, supposedly, they're probably CIA and they have some other job. They just have a title of assistant something or other. But if they don't know anything about economics and they're working for USAID, it's an indication that they're not really USAID people.
We could deduce that, correct?
Yeah, and that's no secret. It's sort of a laughing thing among expats that a lot of CIA people wind up in places like USAID because it's a nice place and it looks like they're doing legitimate work and maybe they attend a few meetings but don't say much. So it's a good place to hide.
Mm-hmm. Well, gosh, this has been a really interesting interview. I've just really enjoyed speaking with you. So what kind of projects do you have coming up?
Well, that's the problem. I have too many projects. Every time I finish a novel, I think of 2 or 3 or 4 new ideas. Whenever I turn on Fox News, I think of a new idea. I'm working on one now called Bangkok Body Parts, which is it takes place in Bangkok, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Macau, and it involves Professor Page, the same protagonist who's in Justifiable Homicide. Mm-hmm. He's teaching over there for the summer, and he has a relationship with a female accounting professor who's Thai, and she introduces him to some students. And then there's this sort of rogue doctor who goes around kidnapping people and harvesting their body parts and selling them in Asia. And so Page contacts one of his CIA contacts, and they try to do something about it. And I have two endings. I don't know which one I'm going to use because they're both good endings. Mm-hmm. I'm working on that one. Yeah. Then I'm working on one where someone is abused by the IRS. I'm using some of my personal history to do that one, to sort of highlight the abuse and how they can destroy people's lives even though they don't owe taxes and so forth.
Right. Yeah, that's the kind of information that should be, the fiction's a great way to kind of to share truth because you can't be held liable for it.
Yeah, that's true. And I changed the names to protect the guilty. And I'm working on volume 3 of the Iraqi Girl Trilogy. That's going to be a really good one, I think. I mean, I'm really excited about that because that's imbued with a lot of interpersonal stuff and political philosophy.
Wonderful. And we can get your books on Amazon, is that correct?
Yes, Amazon.com. And there are several Robert McGee's on there. So if you want to find mine, you say Robert W. McGee. There's another guy who does other stuff. So they're all available on Amazon. And my website, robertwmcgee.com. You can order them through there as well.
And there we go. We're heading out now. So if you're listening, please check out, please get a chance to check out his books and his website. And please remember to donate.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.